everybody, it's Raheel here, back with the latest in Snapchat news from Vietnam. Vietnam was a colony of France since the 1800s called Indochina until it was forcibly taken by the Japanese as a part of an expansion of their empire during World War II. A US and USSR-backed revolution in the country at the time, led by the Viet Minh, whose leader was Ho Chi Minh, was launched in order to take it back from the Japanese. After they took power back from the Japanese imperial forces, France came looking back for their lost territory, setting the stage for the First Indochina War.
Ho Chi Minh took power in 1941 following the separation of Vietnam into northern and southern parts, with North Vietnam becoming purely communist. It was during this time where the First Indochina War was going on, as the French wanted to recolonize Vietnam in order to make up for their losses during World War II. However, as Ho Chi Minh assumed leadership over North Vietnam, guerrilla soldiers aided the North Vietnam Army in their fight against the French forces, which ultimately led to their downfall as a result of the Battle of Bien Dien Phu, with the USSR and China aiding North Vietnam by sending them war supplies, and the creation of the Ho Chi Minh Trails, which ultimately changed the way war was fought in Vietnam.
In the 1950s, Harry S. Truman was the president, and the U.S. began to send military advisors to Vietnam in order to help the French. Now remember that the French were fighting the Viet Minh at the time, and we had to support them. U.S. continued to use domino theory and containment in order to stop communism. Now, Geneva Accords came into play in 1954, and this needed to end the First Indochina War. Vietnam divided along the 17th parallel into a communist north and a capitalist south. This foreshadows a similar conflict that happened in Korea.
Hi, this is Anika Nana, Snapchat News. Let's keep up with the gossip. Eisenhower in Vietnam. The U.S. gives economic aid to France to fight the Vietnam because of the fall of China due to communism. Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. Think about it, little kids, twins maybe, even being separated. Let's think about that. But anyways, catalyzing a massive intercounty migration. Eisenhower and the Doles meet and support Diem's presidency of the South Vietnam. Eisenhower helped the South Vietnam because they were anti-communist, but the U.S. still finds himself in war. However, Eisenhower does send advisors to help the Diem's army. Ho Chi Minh kept in control of the North Vietnam because their leader Ho Chi Minh was the leader of opposition and communism. The U.S. tried to use the South Vietnam to help them go into war against the North, but this still was the leading to a civil war.
Hello, I'm Sarah Castillo with Snapchat News, and today I'll be talking about Kennedy and the Gulf of Tonkin situation. So Kennedy was really tough on communism, believing strongly in the domino theory, in which is the belief that if some parts of Europe and Asia were to fall to communism, it would be like a domino and the rest would fall as well. And communism in capitalist terms, aka more American, is a big no-no. So Kennedy was sending loads of resources and ports to our allies, the capitalist South, but they were losing steam and the North was gaining steam, which is something we couldn't have. But before anything could be done to further Kennedy's support, at least, he was assassinated. This left his vice president, Johnson, to take the presidency, and he was a lot tougher on communism. And he was sending ground troops and ships. And one of these ships, the USS Maddox, had entered Vietnamese water, North Vietnamese water to be more exact, and was attacked. So they retreated because they were like, we ain't getting part of this. And reportedly 2 days after, August 4th, the Maddox was attacked again by North Vietnamese ships. And this had sparked our American spirit to hey, let's get down there, let's help the South Vietnamese, therefore escalating the war.
The U.S. intention to help the French with Vietnam progressively ended up being just a war between Vietnamese and the U.S. only. Now, Operation Rolling Thunder was a codename for an American bombing that was campaigned during the Vietnam War. U.S. military aircraft attacked targets throughout North Vietnam from March 1965 until October 1968. This massive bombardment was intended to put military pressure on North Vietnam's communist leaders and reduce their capacity to wage war against the U.S.-supported government of South Vietnam.
The ground war accelerates. Up until 1965, the war was fought through air power and economic aid. March of 1965, Johnson sends 3,000 troops into Vietnam. By December of 1965, more than 200,000 troops were deployed in Vietnam. The three main phases of the ground war included Phase 1, consisted of creation of a coalition of ground troops. Phase 2 involved the use of ground and air superiority to flush out guerrilla forces to push them back to populated areas. Phase 3, if the NVA and Viet Cong are still present, the use of more ground troops and non-conventional means of winning the war, including nuclear weapons. Search and destroy missions were used all over Vietnam in order to take out Viet Cong troops in the jungle. Most of these tactics failed due to Viet Cong spies in the southern Vietnamese governments. This campaign displaced over 2 million Vietnamese citizens.
It's your girl Sarah, and I'm back with TV and its effects on the Vietnam War. This led to things actually being filmed, such as Operation Rolling Thunder, in which you could see us dropping bombs and missiles on the Vietnamese homes, and it's honestly really cool videos of Americans helping out and aiding a country in need. But then there was also another side to this, in which news reporters were being sent with platoons out into the fields, and they were being shot at, and some were even getting injured on film, and all of this was being shown to the average American. And this really brought it home to a lot of people, as the wars and the horrors that were seen by these normal soldiers were being brought to light, and the war became all that more real. It really brought home what we were doing and how devastating it is in some ways, war is, especially on the soldiers.
Hanoi's political strategy, total mobilization of propaganda, manipulating civilians to support the North Vietnamese cause. North Vietnamese put out propaganda to lower the morale of enemy troops and to promote desertion from South Vietnamese soldiers. After the propaganda was in place, guerrilla tactics were used to slowly pick off U.S. troops. They were ambushed and they didn't know who they were fighting. It lowered the morale of them and the public. After that was in place, a huge all-out offensive of North Vietnamese troops as a final-ditch effort. Fourth-generation warfare was used. There was blurred lines between civilians and combatants. Nation versus nation does not exist during the Vietnam War.
Hey everybody, it's Raheel, here to cap off the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon ran on the promise of ending U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, which won him the 1968 election. He did pull out of the war, but not before launching massive offensives in Laos and Cambodia, which caused massive protests in universities across America, especially Kent State, where 4 students died tragically. Vietnam was promised free and fair elections, however this never came to fruition because of more infighting in the country. After a while, the U.S. just decided to end their involvement and slowly transferred fighting from American troops to ARVN troops, which were South Vietnamese troops. Eventually, they were overwhelmed by the North's power, and they fell to communism. Because of this, the U.S. and South Vietnam were prompted to sign the Paris Treaty, which ended the Vietnam War in a decisive Viet Cong victory, uniting the country under the communist North, which it still ruled by today.